So a man outside of his church found this wallet stuffed with money, picked it up, he takes it to his friend. Look what I found. The friend says, so are you going to return it? And the guy says, I don't know yet. I'm still trying to decide if it's a temptation from the devil or an answered prayer. So temptation is a very complex idea. And it exists, I believe, on that line between our humanity and our divinity. And the benefits of resisting temptation, of course, have been extolled by psychiatrists and philosophers and preachers and therapists and of course, moms for centuries. The Lord's Prayer asks us to lead us not into temptation. I think a better translation is lead us away from temptation, as we sing every week. And you've heard the adage, better to shun the bait than to struggle in the snare, referring to temptation. But is temptation really a bad thing? That's what we want to look at today. Is it something to be resisted or even avoided altogether? So the Zohar, which are the main texts of the Kabbalah, a mystical arm of Judaism, great books full of wonderful wisdom. And there's a story in the Zohar about a king who had a son whom he loved very much. And he told his son, if you want to be my successor, you must promise never to sleep with prostitutes. Big promise for a young prince. But the son promised. And when the son reached 20 years of age, the father decided to test him. And so he went out and he found the most beautiful harlot in the kingdom. He asked her to seduce the son with all the tricks that she knew. And she tried and tried and tried. And the son, of course, was very tempted, but he overcame his desire. He realized in that moment what a deep love he had for his father, that he didn't want to betray him. He didn't want to abandon that love. And he believed in the principles that his father shared with him growing up, and he knew that in the long term, this was the right thing to do, was to resist. So he did not succumb to his short-term desires, and of course, the king kept his word, and the son became king. Now, the moral of the story, of course, is who in the story had the tools to help the son actually get closer to his father? It was the harlot. It was the source of temptation. So in this case, temptation really helped the prince grow. It was not to be, it was a good thing in that case. But if we're going to talk about temptation, now, we have to go back to the very beginning, where it all started. In Genesis chapter 2, in that pristine Garden of Eden, where the first humans were faced with the very first temptation, and they succumbed to it, making them as gods, knowing the difference between good and evil, or right and wrong, and getting them cast out of the garden forever, by the way, as well. Well, we in Unity see this story as an allegory, like many of the Old Testament stories, and we see Adam and Eve just as representations of the masculine and feminine aspects of humanity. Now, according to the story, God instructed Adam and Eve not to eat of a certain tree in the middle of the garden, or they would surely die, said God. Okay, now that's big, coming from God. That's about the severest test you can face. Do this and you'll die. So don't do that, right? Simple. But then the serpent comes along. And in Genesis 3:1, it says that the serpent is the craftiest of all the animals that the Lord created, reminding us that, of course, God also created the serpent. And this talking serpent says, oh, you'll not die. In fact, you're going to become more like God, knowing good and evil. Now, that sounded great to Eve. So she said, okay. And she ate the apple, and then she handed the apple to Adam, who apparently was sitting there the whole time, and asked him to take the bite. And as soon as they took a bite, their eyes were opened. And suddenly, what's the first thing that happened? They became aware that they were naked. They became aware of their individuality. Suddenly, they were separate. And the next thing that happened is they felt shame. For the first time, they felt shame. They immediately made some clothes, supposedly from fig leaves, which really aren't that big. And suddenly they were afraid. They became afraid, and they ran and hid from God. Okay, and then here comes God. It says, God was just taking a stroll through the garden, and he saw Adam hiding. And God says, Adam, why are you hiding? And Adam said, I was naked and afraid, just like the reality show. And so I hid because I was ashamed. And God is like, who told you you were naked? Have you been eating the fruit of that tree I told you not to eat from? God knew immediately what had gone on. And what happens next is great. Adam gets so, scared. What's the first thing Adam says? It was that woman that you put here, God, that tempted me to eat that apple. And then God looks at Eve, and what's the first thing Eve goes? It was that serpent, Lord, that tempted me. Shame, fear, and now blaming. Things that didn't exist before this knowledge of good and evil. So it sounds to me like Adam and Eve have discovered their egos. And it's coming on strong for them. So did God lie? Adam and Eve did not die after they ate of the fruit, or did they? Perhaps what died was their innocence. And I'm thinking that this whole temptation thing really is a coming-of-age story for the human soul, a sort of a rite of passage, the first bar mitzvah. Today I am God. The temptation of the serpent, just like in the story of the king, was necessary for Adam and Eve to move up to their next level of spiritual maturity. If we think about our babies, when they're toddlers, they're running around, they're naked, they're shameless, right? They're without a second thought. They live in this idyllic Eden-like world where everything is provided for them. Everything is yes. There are people all around them all the time just waiting to give them whatever they ask for. And then at a certain age, they learn that word, no. And it's like, what? There's such a thing as no? Everything used to be yes, and now there's a no? It's a big shock to their systems. They're cast out of that idyllic world where everything is provided for them. They begin to learn how to use this new tool they have for getting what they want, choice. Okay, now they can refuse to eat certain foods, even if they love it. They can say no, and they have a choice. What clothes they wear, what would you like to wear today, dear? And you never know what they're going to wear, but they have the choice now to wear it. They're exercising this new knowledge of good and evil, of right and wrong, the knowledge of yes and no. So this is the step into the next phase of development as we grow humans. It's kind of a coming out party for the ego. George Eliot wrote, "No man is matriculated to the art of life till he has been well tempted." Now Adam and Eve, having been well tempted, were now ready to leave the garden, go out on their own, and start being fruitful and multiplying, basically. And they did that very well. But from then on, the serpent had become known as Satan, the devil, Lucifer, the tempter, the deceiver. And temptation, since then, has been given a really bad rap as the cause of the fall of man. Now, the word tempt comes from the Latin base word, which basically means simply to try, as in attempt, making temptation more of a guidepost than the culprit. In unity, we don't believe in the pitchfork-wielding troublemaker, nor do we believe that Satan is an opposing power to God. The Satan has one tool, and that is temptation. He can't interfere in our lives. He can't intervene in any way. He can only tempt. And we see the devil or Satan in unity as that negative force that we all have within us. We could call it our shadow sides, that Satan consciousness, if you will. And it manifests into the world as our egos. The same way that we say we're God in expression, well, we're also our shadow sides in expression. Whether we want to or not, we're expressing both sides all the time because they're integral parts of who we are. And when that shadow side shows up, it's really our egos attempting to deceive us into believing that what we want is outside of ourselves. That second donut, that affair, that picking that lost wallet with money in it. whatever we want, our desires that are outside of ourselves. And the ego uses temptation as its tool to do that. So temptation's not our enemy. In fact, it's a tool given to us at birth, at creation, so that we may discern and discover our true nature. And it can be a negative force within us, but only when we let it control us. Just like we talk about our ego. It's not something we want to get rid of. It's just something we want to control. We'll make sure that it doesn't control us. But temptation can be very positive if we see the inclinations that come from that Satan consciousness as a jumping point for us to grow and become the best that we can become. So in the New Testament, we have the story of Jesus' temptation. It was by Satan, and it was right after his baptism. Now, we know this is a made-up story because nobody, of course, could have been there to document this, and as far as we know, Jesus never mentioned it. But it appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Jesus was in the desert supposedly for 40 days when this happened, and we know that 40 days just means as long as it takes. So I'm picturing Jesus meditating in the desert, fasting, no food, no water. And after a few days, however long it was, he was probably in a really, really super high vibration kind of trance state. He may even have been hallucinating when he reached that realization of his godhood. And he realized the power that meant that he had. And it was probably at that time when the ego stepped in and he thought, with this power, I could change these rocks into bread and have some food. With this newly discovered God power within me, I could fall off this cliff and not be harmed. Or I could use my wisdom and power to rule Judea. His ego was going crazy, trying to get his attention off of his power that he had discovered within himself and on to the fulfillment of those outside desires of the world. So James, in 1 James, and James, by the way, is the brother of Jesus, by most scholars agree, he says in 1:13, no one, when tempted, should say, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. So according to James, Jesus was tempted by his own desire to turn those stones to bread for food or to rule the kingdoms of the earth and to live a long and prosperous life. But Jesus told his selfish desires what? Get thee behind me, Satan, ego, tempter. He chose the way that demonstrated the highest expression of his true Christ nature. He made the ultimate sacrifice. He made the choice to serve instead of to rule. And as a result of this temptation, he emerged from the desert experience a fully realized, Christed being. Emmett Fox, one of our great Unity writers, in the awesome book, The Sermon on the Mount, which is a metaphysical interpretation, basically, of Matthew, he says that the more spiritually mature we become, the more intensely we will be tempted. Eek. Our temptations are drawn to us according to what we are able to handle at the present level of our understanding. So the fact that Jesus was tempted so largely was a tribute to how far advanced he was on his spiritual journey. So we can use temptation as a barometer to where we are on our spiritual journey. You know, as spiritual beings, we all want to behave honestly, all of the time. All right, that desire is there even when we have an opportunity to anonymously cheat for personal gain. That desire to behave honestly is there, and it's what gives us pause to stop and think about it and have a little self-examination. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that temptation is the barometer by which we measure our virtue, and that we gain the strength of the temptations we resist. So in that regard, we can invite temptation into our life as learning tools and ways to strengthen our spiritual selves. So we have this knowledge of good and evil, yet all too often we still choose to exercise our free will and succumb to temptation. And that's okay, because it's not a sin to give in to temptation. But it can be frustrating sometimes. Paul certainly struggles with this, the Apostle Paul, not that one. When in Romans chapter 7, verses 7 through 25, it's a whole thing about how the law is good and temptation comes in then and uses the law to tempt him. But then he finally says, the things I want to do, I do not. And the things I do not want to do, I do. Very frustrating. And he called himself a hopeless sinner because he doesn't understand why he does the things he doesn't want to do and he doesn't do the things he wants to. But I know that we have all experienced that at some point in our lives. Every day I'm tempted. I'm tempted by one thing or another. It could be a lot of things. It could be that second donut, which was the kind of subtitle to this talk today, the second donut as a metaphor for our temptations. It could be to lie, to cancel an appointment, or maybe finding an item that the cashier forgot to check out and not returning it. Whatever it is, we all have those second donuts in our life. But it's not always a choice between two opposing forces. It's not always a choice between right or wrong. For instance, yesterday I was thinking, what a beautiful day it is outside while I'm working. Going, what a beautiful day it is outside. I'm tempted to take a bike ride, to go for a nice bike ride. Well, whether to work or to take a break is a choice between really two desirable things. But it's still considered temptation. And I still learn from it because I chose not to do the bike ride and stay home and work. And did I feel sorry? I felt a little sorry at the end of the day, but I didn't feel like at least I did anything wrong because I wasn't choosing between right and wrong. Most of the times, I'm able to resist temptation, and I know you are too. But sometimes I give in to it. And we learn from both times. We learn when we give in to it, and we learn when we resist it. The biggest lesson from temptation is noticing what it is that's tempting you. And this is the window to my freedom. That's where the lesson is. Temptation helps me to see what I need to work on in my life, what is distracting me from reaching my full potential as a spiritual being. It shows me the things that I'm desiring outside of myself, and it helps me use my denials and affirmations to move beyond those into a more healthier way of thinking and speaking. So the paradox of temptation then is that it tries to lure us away from the divine, yet it's the very thing that makes us aware of it. It's moving us ever closer to it every time it arises in us. If you're never tempted to go against your base spiritual desires, then they will never take root. It's like in the parable of the seeds that fell on a rocky soil. Temptation is what makes our ethereal spiritual beliefs, those things that we think are so beautiful. Well, I'm one with God. I'm heir to all God's kingdoms. It takes those ethereal beliefs and grounds them in a real physical manifestation on earth as it is in heaven. So what do we do with this temptation? We don't want to avoid it. A lot of times we're told to avoid temptation at all costs. But then when you avoid temptation, what are you doing? You're just ignoring what your soul is trying to tell you you need to work on. So we don't want to avoid temptation. We want to welcome it. But the next time you're tempted, here are 5 things that you can do that may help get you through. The first thing is to draw the line. Draw the line and don't cross over. What that means is if I'm going into a situation where I know I may be tempted beforehand, I draw the line. I decide beforehand how I'm going to respond if anything like that comes up. And it's much easier than deciding in the moment when there's that maybe peer pressure or whatever it is, or the temptation right in front of you. I'll say, okay, I'll have 1 donut, but if I'm offered that second donut, I'm going to say no, period. And by drawing that line, you eliminate the power temptation has on you in that moment. You've already decided what you're going to do, and you've already decided to stick to it. Take a drink. Number 2, ask yourself this question: how will I feel about this at the end of the day? If I give in to temptation or whether I resist, how will I feel about it at the end of the day? Usually at the end of my day, when I'm laying in bed, I'm sitting there and I'm starting to remember things. I kind of go through my whole day in my head. And I remember things that I wish I hadn't said, or maybe things I wish I had said. I'm going over things I wish I'd done or had done differently. My therapist tells me don't do that, but still, I think it makes me stop and think, will this be one of those things that at the end of the day, I'm going to look back on and regret? Because I always strive to have one of those perfect days. When I go to sleep at night, I think back, and a day where I look back, there's nothing I would change, there's nothing left unsaid, nothing I regret. Asking these questions gives us perspective and also helps to delay that desire for immediate gratification. So ask, how will I feel about this at the end of the day? Number 3, of course, we pray. Praying means remembering who you are. Remember, the Sanskrit word for prayer means seeing yourself as wondrously made. Remember who you are. You're a physical manifestation of the divine in expression. You have a will. You have the will of God in you. And you can make the best choice. You can use your power of judgment and discernment to make the best choice every time. If necessary, speak these words to your ego. Get thee behind me, Satan, or get thee behind me, temptation, and just stand in your power of knowing who you are. Number 4, denial and affirmation. Those are tools that we use in Unity kind of to reprogram our thought patterns from erroneous beliefs into the truth. And in this situation, you could say with power, this desire has no power over me. This temptation has no power over me. In truth, I am not tempted at all. So the first part, that's the denial. This desire has no power over me. And then the affirmation, in truth, I am not tempted at all. Realizing that what tempts you is a byproduct of our ego, instead of fighting temptation, we start to look at it as a guidepost toward our good. Temptation not only turns us toward our good, toward our true selves, it forces us to look at the things that tempted us in the first place and why they're tempting us. And that's the key to our personal growth through our ego and our temptation. And number 5, always be grateful. Be grateful for this opportunity to grow. Take a deep breath into your heart space when you're feeling it. You may be feeling, whenever temptation arises, you're feeling a little fear about that. Take a breath into your heart space, and just as you release that breath, give thanks for this opportunity to look at yourself, to grow, and to grow in spiritual understanding. Be grateful. Don't be fearful. In truth, there are really never any wrong choices. They're all just effects of those choices that we make. But some speed up your journey toward the divine, some slow down that journey toward the divine, or even keep you stuck. But all roads, all choices eventually lead us to our goal of our divinity. Just as the addict may credit his addiction or the havoc it caused in his life of leading him to God. Just as the Apostle Paul said, give thanks in all things. Give thanks in all things, even when you're tempted. Even when you give in to temptation. What do you learn from that? Give thanks. So, temptation, is it a friend or an enemy? Should it be resisted or welcomed or avoided altogether? When we avoid temptation, we're ignoring the call of our soul to look at something that may be holding us back, blocking our spiritual growth. But temptation calls us to choose at what level of consciousness we wish to be at in any given moment. I believe temptation is both a defining element of our human nature as well as a physical demonstration of our divine gift of free will, making temptation, in a sense, a bridge between our humanity and our divinity. So temptation, what is it good for? Possibly, absolutely everything. So let's take a deep breath. Thank you, and prepare for our meditation. As we connect with that divine within us, and we breathe in and out that energy of prana in the air, the Easterners believe God's energy in every breath we take. When we take a deep breath into our heart space, we are energizing every cell in our heart, every cell in our body with that energy. And as we breathe deeper and deeper and bring our awareness down into our depths of our being, we begin to connect with our true selves. We see that light, that divine spark within us. But we also see another presence. We see the ego. We see that Satan consciousness within us as well. Just as we integrate our masculine and feminine, we have to integrate our Christ consciousness with our Satan consciousness. Think of them as the two wolves, the one of light and the one of darkness, battling one another for control of your soul. And the Native American parable asks us, which one will win control? And the answer in the parable is the one we feed. But what if instead of starving that dark wolf, we tamed it? We see that it is also a holy creation of God. And it becomes our ally, but not our master. Each day presents us with a myriad of choices between two masters, and at each point we must decide which master to serve. Today we draw the line in our consciousness of where we want to be for this day, who we would like to serve. So let's take just a few moments now to reconcile those two forces living within us, just as we would reconcile our masculine and feminine. As we enter into a few moments of silence, make friends with your ego, with your Satan consciousness, with your shadow. Invite it to participate, but only when called upon. Speak to it silently now from your divine nature in the silence. We begin to bring our attention back into this space, to the sanctuary, into your living room, into your present moment. We give thanks for this opportunity to look deep within ourselves, to become whole with who we are on every level. Move forward today with great expectations of good, welcoming the tests of temptation, and knowing that they serve us. For this we give thanks, and so it is.